Thank you. So I'm calling the meeting to order quickly. And before we do roll call, our illustrious attorney, Mr. Ryan, has informed me that when Wendy leaves for her 2:30 class, which she must do, we will need to pause and see if we still have a quorum. So we have to do the best we can in the time we have allotted. My editorial, my first one for today is I would prefer that we maintain substantive conversation and come back to this next month rather than to foreshorten our comments today. Okay, so I guess the next step is roll call.
Lammers?
Here.
Jessica Gao?
Here.
Wendy Anderson?
Here.
Tyler Momberg?
Here.
Sarah Lee Morrissey is absent. Bob Fitzsimmons also absent. John Hoblick? Jack Surratt?
Here.
Eli Tobias? Bliss Jameson? Bill Lights?
Here.
Bernie Lafise?
Here.
And Alex Zielinski also is absent today. But we do have a quorum, at least for now.
So moved.
Again, how much I can forget in a month. Dr. Anderson has moved that we approve the minutes. Do we have a second?
Second.
We have a second by Jack Surratt. Any discussion? All those in favor of approval of the minutes for August 2nd as written?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Minutes stand approved. Our discussion for today, we're continuing to talk about wetlands, and specifically, if I can get my little piece of paper, we decided that we would address suggestions on modified buffer widths and strengthening requirements. We would review and provide comments, particularly on page 3 of the document that staff distributed. Staff will provide an overview of the fees that are charged for the various things that we do regarding wetlands. Staff will research platted small lots that may contain wetlands. I think we were trying to get an idea of the magnitude of that because we were spending a lot of time on it, and it is perhaps, it's not something necessarily that we can do a lot about, I think. Have interactive maps available for review. The growth in population in Volusia County cities from 1990 to 2020 was indeed 97%. Sorry, that's one of my notes. Okay, and have the interactive maps for review. So would we like to begin with a discussion of modified buffer widths and the possibility of strengthening requirements?
Well, can I ask just real quick if we can talk about the platted small lots? Because I think we can, yes, get that out of the way potentially.
I have no objection. Does anyone have an objection to getting that off our plate? Okay, please continue, Ginger.
So this really was because when we, at our last meeting, we were looking at some of the cases where it's hard for us to implement avoidance and minimization because there are existing lots that have entitlements. And to implement avoidance and minimization or to tell someone that they can't impact the wetlands to build their house would really probably result in a taking, right? And so the question was, what is the volume of that? And so we did some really basic GIS analysis. And so looked at the lots that are considered by the property appraiser to be residential and vacant. No size sorting at all, just if it's a lot that's residential and vacant in the unincorporated part of the county. And we used the National Wetland Inventory map as our proxy for, are there wetlands on that lot, right? And we talked a little bit about the limitations of the existing wetland mapping, but for this exercise, we chose that as our sort of proxy. So when you do that, we come up with, I'll pass these, 12,821 lots in the unincorporated county that are vacant, residential, and may contain wetlands. I have a small map coming around that just sort of plots those on the county. So the red blobs are dots that represent a parcel. There's a big map up on that door that is the same map. So just sort of to represent where those are in the county. And anywhere you see a large red area, those are lots of lots, right? Some of those areas are what we consider antiquated subdivisions that are actually, they don't meet the requirements to get a building permit on their own. Now, there is some ability to collect multiple of those lots, and maybe you could get a building permit if you had enough of those lots and you combined them into something that met some sort of zoning size requirements. Most of them do not meet the zoning sizes, or they are on antiquated plats where there's no actual physical access. So, further work could refine this to say, what are those lots that are small-ish, where you might actually not be able to avoid a wetland, right? Like if it's you're a quarter-acre lot and you're going to put a house and there's a wetland, you're probably going to impact that wetland. If it's a 10-acre lot and there's a wetland, depending on what the wetland looks like, you may be able to avoid it, right? So, I mean, we could refine this information. That will take significantly more work. This was the easy work right here, was just sorting all the parcels in the county. So I don't know how much further you want to go in this sort of line of inquiry, but if you want more work, let us know.
Ms. Gao.
So just a quick overview statement is that, to me, this doesn't fall that far away from the discussion we had on historic trees. The owner, rights to remove historic trees. We're not saying that these lots aren't buildable. We're saying that you have to follow a process if you would like to impact the wetlands in order to build. And so it's a lot more lots than I expected to see.
Also, do we have an overlay of where these lots are located in Norma or Eco?
Okay, that's a great question. So we do have the ability today to pull up our interactive mapper, and we can turn layers on and off. This layer isn't in that interactive mapper because it's something that we made up. It's not part of our permitting system. So we can't today pull this layer up and compare it with Norma and Eco. Easy enough to do on a map. Like we could do that for next time, or even I could probably get it while we're here. But I can't pull it up and turn on and off other layers since it doesn't exist in the main permitting database.
Okay, because the reason I was asking that was it looks like a lot of them are, from my visual memory. And if so,
Well, and I can ask Kelly to do that and bring us a map.
but so basically the question with this is, are we going to increase requirements for these areas, for these small, non-conforming lots?
I'm sorry, say that again.
So basically what we will be doing with this is look at the ordinances that impact these particular lots.
Well, so the way I understood our request from last time was how many lots are out there where there are unavoidable wetland impacts, right? Because we were talking about how we use avoidance and minimization to try to reduce the amount of wetland or buffer impact in the county. But there are times when we can't really do that without taking the property. And so this was how many lots are out there where if you came to build a house, you're probably going to have to impact wetlands, and we're probably going to have to say that that's okay and permit it and require mitigation.
And this, again, also, and we talked about it last month, it also backs up to the Volusia Forever Small Lot Acquisition Program, which takes these, and Jessica can possibly speak more about this, but it takes these lots, particularly the ones that don't have access roads and that are non-conforming. And some of these obviously are in environmentally sensitive areas, and just, try to assemble and purchase these small lots to place them into conservation, because they're really difficult in terms. Do you have anything to add to that, Jessica?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that the focus of the Volusia Forever small lot acquisition program so far has been platted subdivisions that don't necessarily have infrastructure serving the lots that are out there. So I think some of these would fit.
Yeah.
Most of those are recommended or, brought forward by staff. So I think that we could keep taking a look at those.
Yeah, I even question if the one up here in the far northeast corner of the county is the Ford Marsh property that right now is going before the ARC. Not sure for Florida Forever, this one right here. Yeah. Okay. So there's that going on with these lots too, just reminding it.
I missed last time, so I was just listening to the recordings. Thank you very much. And it is important to use the microphones. But so I heard a discussion about avoidance minimization, and these lots were difficult to avoid and minimize. Did we ever get to and if, the majority of these don't have access anyways, that makes it less than, if we have 12,800 of these, let's just say we have 4,000 that could be built on and that you might not be able to use avoidance minimization, or you would tell them to avoid and minimize by the way that you design the house. But my real question is, did we ever get to a discussion of avoidance minimization and making that understandable? I didn't remember hearing the end of that.
Keith was also out.
Yeah, also was it
So
here? And I have not listened to it, so I'm not aware that you ever got to in a conversation about avoidance minimization. And you did? Okay, what was Bill's asking for the outcome?
I don't think there was an outcome. I think we just kind of discussed it towards the end of the meeting.
I don't know that we fully complied with our mission, which was to further clarify what each of those terms meant. Ginger, do you feel that we satisfied that?
I think we talked a lot about it, and I think a lot has happened in a month. Agreed that we do need to better define that. We didn't decide what that better definition necessarily was at the last meeting, but that yes, if we're using that in our regular permitting decisions, that it's good for the staff and it's good for the applicants to understand what that looks like. So, kind of what are the standards for review, so to speak.
And it might be different for these small lots that are already platted and they have some entitlements versus how you would apply it to a bigger development where you're now platting it, right? Is kind of the bottom line.
Right. Well, I mean, we use the avoidance and minimization criteria that we have now on these lots and on regular lots. And I think from our staff perspective, it works okay, right? If it's a situation where, and we had the example of the Daytona Park Estates lot where there's no way to build a house on that lot without impacting the wetland, then that meets our avoidance and minimization criteria because you cannot actually avoid. You maybe can minimize a little bit, right? So you get past that test, right? So in the permit process, you have this test. Can you avoid the wetland? If so, you should. Okay, if you can't, you can minimize it. All right, can we move the house around on this lot? If you can't, then you've passed that test, and then you get to mitigate. And so it works now, but I think there has been some concern that, the way I interpret that or the way Keith interprets that may not be the way that you do or you do or you do. And so is there a way to make that more clear?
Thank you. So the airplanes are backing up. I'm going to go to Dr. Anderson, then Tyler, then Jessica.
Okay, I just have a question for clarification. So did we define what small lots are for this discussion? Because are we talking about a half acre? Are we talking about 3 acres, 7 acres, 33.87 acres? Are we talking, what are we talking about for small lots? A lot that can only have one house on it, or a lot that could potentially be further subdivided for 2 or more houses?
we think a residentially zoned lot, that is, quarter acre, the half, whatever it's typically zoned for residential use. I think that's it. I mean, you're talking about those larger lots. They're typically RC, agriculture. That's not the small residential lot we're talking about. We're talking about R3, R4, those types of residential zone designations.
Tyler.
So I think to add a little bit of comment for Bill, one of the things that we were getting into in the discussion was there are lots, for example, we were talking about Daytona Park Estates, that 80% or more of the lot is wetland. The part that's not wetland is not where you build the house because it's the side of the road. And no matter what, we are filling the lot. We're having to raise for the septic tank. It's basically the 10,000 square feet of lot, 8,000 of it gets filled. And, what can we do to avoid? What can we do to minimize? And are there greater standards that we would like to apply or not? And I tend to think that a lot of these lots, if they're vested, if we have the road open, that I'm going to say that that's a lost battle and not where we should put our energy. When I look at this map, 12,000 lots is a lot. I know Daytona Park Estates is part of this red blob that's between State Road 44 and US 92, kind of on the east side of DeLand. And it's not all of that red blob that is open lot. So there's a good chunk of those that are not, you couldn't walk in today and apply for a building permit, no matter how many you group together. But certainly there's a good chunk there that you could. I think it's a similar situation when we look on the east side of Diaz and when we look at what's down in
Where's your map,
Scottsmore
Rob?
Oak Hill
Your map
area,
is
that a
your
lot
map.
of these are not
But the
accessible lot
blob,
today. And so that's one of the questions that I had last time was, what the real number is. And I don't know how much work it is to find out to cross-reference open streets, like the lots that are on open addressable streets today, quote unquote. But I think that those are the lots that are kind of a lost cause. The other 8,000 of these, or 4,000 or 2,000, I mean, unknown number, I'm making up numbers now. I see as there's still teeth because they're going to require rezoning or replatting or some type of effort before they move forward to build for a road to get there for the infrastructure construction. And so I don't see those as the wetland damage as a foregone conclusion. So for me, it's a question of what's the scale? 12,000 lots, that's a lot, but is it a lot in the scheme of acreage? If it's all of this Daytona Park Estates blob and all of the Scottsmore blob, then yeah, that I would want to have more of a conversation. But if it's really only 10% of these or something, then I kind of think that we've got pretty good protections in place. And, it's just one of those unfortunate things that the code got updated over time. And so I would say leave it as is if it's what I'm thinking it appears to be.
Jessica.
I think just to further tie that into the discussion last time, I think this topic was also raised, especially the small lots, in terms of looking at the exemptions for wetland permitting and kind of how those apply to small lots and whether you're getting that mitigation or not with vested lots. And so that's just, I remember we discussed it and didn't really land anywhere. So I just wanted to put that out as we discussed today. That was another consideration of they're vested, they're going to be built. If they're less than a quarter acre, should they still provide mitigation or not is something that could be discussed.
And forgive me, I believe that in that if they're less than a quarter acre, using that Daytona Park example, wasn't it sort of a cascading impact so that it ended up being more than one?
I did want to clarify one thing. When you have wetland impacts like in Daytona Park Estates, some of them are exempt from mitigation with DEP, but some only if the wetland itself is isolated and less than half an acre. If the wetland itself is bigger than half an acre and you have an impact, you still have to mitigate. So the county does get some mitigation.
Sort of. So it's the county code that exempts wetlands that are under a half acre. So if the total wetland is less than a half acre, it is exempt. If the total wetland is more than a half acre and you impact some amount of it, it's not exempt, even if the impact is less than a half acre. The DEP exemption is a square footage thing. It was 4,000 square feet, regardless of the size of the wetland.
And that's one of the faults to be corrected in the ordinances, is it not, to remove that DEP exemption language?
Well,
No,
yeah, that's the DEP language. That's not us.
it's in the deck.
Right, I mean, we can discuss about whether or not the half acre exemption that the county code has is appropriate. But for any amount of impact to a wetland more than a half acre, we will require permitting and mitigation.
There was a potential change to remove FDEP permit exemption language for minimum standard.
Yeah. That's a different issue.
Okay.
Sorry, that's what I was referring to. Thank you, Bernie.
I just want to point to the map up here, the majority red blob area that you guys are talking about, and you're thinking it's Daytona Park Estates. It's not. It's the east of that, and that's this land scam area out here. Daytona Park Estates is not the one that's bright red. It's this area to the east.
So
Most of those are small lots and they're not vested.
yeah, and so these aren't going to be permittable without going through a site development.
Well, we've seen people buy pieces and chunks and try to put together enough, to vest it. We've seen that quite a bit.
And just a point of reference, I pulled some up because I was curious. They're almost all 1.25 acres. So that might be a little bit bigger than if you're thinking small acre.
Any conclusions? So what we have on the table, if I've understood you all correctly, is Tyler has made a case for further clarification about the actual number of lots that have physical access to them, could be hooked up to utilities. Yeah. Pardon?
Are you talking about vested lots that have wetland impact?
Yes, and it goes back to, I forget what year it is, but the county engineer had to drive around and determine that the roads were passable with the normal passenger car. And that determined whether or not they were vested, and that's recorded somewhere in the county documents.
Jessica, I think, can elaborate.
Yeah, well, just on that clarification request, I want to say to what end? So if we are reviewing that to see what is vested and what is not, why? Like, what is the end result that we're going to say? Then the exemption should only be 1/8 of an acre, or like, what is the end goal that we're trying to achieve by reviewing vested versus non-vested on these lots before we have county do a lot of research? Right.
I share that question. What's the potential action here that we can take with these 12,000 plus lots? What can we do?
I think part of where we were going last time was, if in fact there are lots that you can't do avoidance and minimization, should there be language to that effect, and what would that language look like, right? Like, I cannot build a house on this lot without impacting a wetland, therefore I have passed the avoidance test. I think that's part of where we were talking about trying to clarify that avoidance and minimization. If in fact there is no other choice, that's what we do now in practice. It just doesn't say that very, very clearly in the code. And do we need it to do that, in the opinion of this committee? And if so, do you want us to try to come up with some language to that effect?
So we would, I'll get to you, Jessica. So we would, I would think, want consistency, right? With the avoidance and the minimization. I don't know why we would not. Happy to learn why not. And then we have exemptions. We have a county exemption for wetland based upon the size of that wetland, not the size of the lot that might be built and damage that wetland. So in your example of the cascading effect in Daytona Park Estates, all of those would be impacting a wetland. Yeah? Should I repeat that? Because, okay, so we already are requiring avoidance and minimization on those small lots when they come before us. Yes? Okay. Do we require mitigation as we would with any other buildable lots? Okay. So because of where this lives in the ordinances, is that why we're talking about making the language clearer? And Jessica, maybe you can take me out of my misery here.
I think, if I'm recalling correctly, the discussion was that it's blurry, right? Avoidance and minimization, the interpretation is blurry. And so if there's language that we could create or direct staff on that would say, there are general criteria, but for this instance, we think that this makes sense. I think maybe that's what they're looking for. So say, because Bernie pointed out they're bigger than an acre, because I was going to use an acre. If you were to say a lot that is less than 2 acres in size, that has more than 65% wetlands, because the county building coverage is like 35. So if you've got over 65% wetlands, you can't get the building coverage under the land development code. Maybe you don't have to prove further avoidance and minimization, if that is what we're aiming for that 35. Like, how are we directing staff is the question.
And I guess what I'm struggling with here is, if we agreed that we needed to further clarify avoidance and minimization in the language, period, what makes the small lots require separate attention for that clarification? That's where I'm confused.
I don't know that the small lots really need that clarification. I think it's built into the size. I think we're struggling with this is the newer subdivisions that are coming in. People, they say, oh, we've avoided and minimized to the greatest extent possible. Well, they've got lots in wetlands, they got lots in buffers. Well, you technically haven't avoided to the greatest extent possible. And the comp plan states that proposed activities within NORMA shall avoid adverse impacts to wetlands and their associated natural, physical, and biological functions, and except in cases where it's demonstrated that it's in the best interest of the overriding of the public. So it's kind of defined really well in the comp plan in NORMA. It's not really defined that well outside of NORMA. So we can always, for these subdivisions that come in, we can always fall back on the comp plan section and say, hey, we have to be consistent with the NORMA section of the comprehensive plan, and this is what it says.
That's sort of why I was also asking how much of this is in NORMA.
Well, yeah.
Because that we could just take all those off the table.
So again,
And the other thing that we talked about last time too was on avoidance and minimization was, there are cases where you have the right and the ability, you need to be able to build a house, right? Daytona Park Estates, great example. But do we have to allow a pool? Do we have to allow accessory structures, right? And so if there are avoidance and minimization criteria related to that, like if the only way to make use of your property is to allow wetland impacts for the principal structure, we could write language that would say, but we interpret this to mean that you don't have an automatic right to accessory structures. And I don't know that the committee, that's for you to tell us your recommendation to the county council, but that is one of the other things we were talking about. And on some of these lots where you just can't avoid it to build your principal structure, that's okay, right? And then you'll have to mitigate, but is that all you get? Or can you eat away at the wetland and the buffer as you come in next year for your pool and then next year for your shed or whatever?
I have a comment to that, but Tyler's had his name up and so has.
So I think the conversation's moved forward a little bit from what I was going to comment on, but ultimately one of the things that I was going to say is and it's been addressed, there's a pretty wide berth between what Jessica was saying of 35% of 2 acres and what Ginger's saying of you have the right to build a house. And I think that's the clarification that would really be helpful. And on the point that I think I've been driving to without making it really make sense for everybody else is the issues aren't on these small lots. There are issues with it, but they're relatively small issues they're worked out without it going to court, as far as I know, always. Like, these aren't things that ultimately are the big money and the big damage issues. What Keith is bringing up that are the big damage issues are the subdivisions that come in. And so, the small lot, do you get to have a 5,000 square foot single story house with a pool because it fits on your lot, regardless of the wetland lines argument? I'm going to have a different opinion than some people in this room, and that's okay. But that system right now is defined well enough, and it's working well enough, and we're not getting a big delta in the outcome, in my opinion, by spending a lot of time on it. I don't think it would be bad to have better definition there. And I think that it would be helpful for that. But from a time perspective, for our efforts and for staff and council's efforts, if we're making recommendations, I really think it's during rezoning. And so basically, if you have vested development rights, it means that you can walk into the local municipality and apply for a building permit. But if I don't have vested development rights, I have to go through a rezoning, a replatting, some type of a drawn out process before I can apply for that building permit. That's the part of the code that really is a little bit ambiguous, is what is minimization and avoidance? I have 100 acres. You're telling me that I have not avoided enough when I've avoided 25 acres. It doesn't matter that 75 of it's wetland and I'm bulldozing 50 acres of it. I've avoided 25 of them, and it's not defined. So if I sit across from Keith and Ginger and argue, and they argue, and we're blue in the face when we walk away, it's up to Jessica then to argue with somebody to figure out who wins. I mean, and that's just not a situation that either party likes to find themselves in. And I found myself in it too often.
Jessica likes it though.
Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, but it does create outcomes that we're not happy with in the back end when we don't involve the actual design experts and the environmental experts in the design process, and we leave it to attorneys and judges and juries. That doesn't necessarily get us the best outcomes for the public.
Oh, and we do have an overarching principle: no net loss of size or function of wetlands in Volusia County. That's the North Star on that. Jack.
Yeah, I don't want to debate anything with Melissa, but I think, to me, I move that we just go ahead and do some clarification as you wish. Put together some language. We can look at that language versus knocking it around, and just go ahead, clarify the circumstance on mitigation and the whole bit, and then we look at that language and say, do we think that fits generally our goal? We're not going to solve all these issues through this. So I think kind of a straightforward clarification that you provide to us, and if we look at it, we can move on it and we can agree.
Jack,
Or not
are you
agree.
referring to small lot or in general?
In general, I'm not referring to small lot. I moved it. Yeah.
Okay, that was a motion.
Can you restate your motion? Minimization, okay. Got it. So I think that my discussion point on the motion would be that I think they're working on that based on last time. And that we needed to provide additional input on what changes. Are they clarifying exactly what they do now? Or is the discussion in a subdivision, the developer attorney is going to argue that you have some right to a reasonable density. And if you are allowed to have 10 units an acre, you should be allowed to have 10 units an acre on the site. But if you have 15 out of 20 acres wetlands and you can only have 5 units an acre, do you get to impact more wetlands? Like, that's, I think, the line in the sand that we need clarification on, that I think causes the confusion on how do you define the reasonable test? And I know you're not entitled to 10 units an acre.
Yeah.
That's the density. I know, Keith, I know. Yeah, I know. That's the maximum. I get it, 0 to 10. But I think that's what is reasonable. And we've already heard that the private side and the county may have different interpretations on how you avoid that and what you have to show to make it reasonable. And so what how do we define it better?
By practice, this is what we do now. I mean, what you're entitled to is what you're entitled to. So, if you've got a one property and you're entitled to that one dwelling unit per 10 acres of density, that's what we look at it. That's what you're entitled to. That's what you get. If you're asking for 10 acres, and you've got, 10 acres of wetland, then that's where we start our fight is, or not fight, but our applying the code. You don't have that right. You don't have that density equivalent.
One other thing that, that we have seen in other codes is a discussion of, do we look at the economic equation related to avoidance and minimization, right? So from an ecological perspective, more avoidance is better. But if you're the property owner or you're the, you're on the team of the property owner and you say, I cannot do this thing unless I have this many square feet of commercial or industrial or this many lots, like where does that economic equation come in avoidance and minimization? And I have seen in some other cases where the code says, irrespective of the economic impact, right? The avoidance and minimization is about the ecology. Ours is silent on that. And that is often where we get into that discussion with the developer or the property owner or whatever is, yeah, you can definitely avoid the wetland and you can put in 2 lots or you can put in, 20,000 square feet of commercial. And they're saying, yeah, but it's only economically viable if I get 15 lots or, 30,000 square feet of commercial. That's where we kind of could use some guidance on should the county, from the wetland perspective, consider the economic part of that equation.
So that moves into a big discussion of the research that we were given. Wendy, Bill, Tyler. Oh, Bliss. Wendy, Bill, Tyler, Bliss.
Okay, so we do still have a motion on the table and
We
we're
do.
discussing it right now. Okay. Can you read the language in the comp plan again, Keith?
Yes, so the comprehensive plan for the natural resource management area says proposed activities within NORMA shall avoid adverse impacts to wetlands and their associated natural, physical, and biological functions, except in cases where it can be demonstrated to be in the overriding public interest.
Okay. And you're saying that that language is what you fall back on for big subdivisions, but you do not apply it to small lots. And that's the point, right? Or no?
No, I mean, as you can see the map here, not everything is NORMA.
Right.
That green layer is NORMA. We've got a lot of impacted area that doesn't, we can't really apply this version of avoidance minimization
Right.
to.
But within NORMA,
Yes.
this applies regardless of the size of the lot.
Yes, but we brought this bullet up
Mhm.
as an example of where the code is not necessarily completely consistent with the comp plan, right?
Right.
And where we probably need to update the code to be consistent with this. So the overriding public interest is a bigger test
Mhm.
than, can you fit what you want to fit on your lot without avoiding wetland impacts? So
Right.
I would say hesitantly that I don't know that we are looking at overriding public interest always when there are developments. And it's in the comp plan, but it's not in the code, and that's a disconnect.
So I would advise within the context of this motion that whatever language you bring back to us, that it be consistent with this language in the comp plan. The code has to be consistent with the comp plan, right? So we need language that is consistent with avoidance, right? The comp plan doesn't say minimization or mitigation, does it? Somewhere else? Okay. Okay. All right.
And I'll put it down because that's in the NORMA overlay. The other standard just on no net loss of function says if, and this is policy 12.2.3.4, if by restriction of attainment of reasonable use, through the county's land development regulations, it's determined that the wetland alteration is unavoidable. Mitigation proposal shall be considered. So that's a different standard. That's reasonable use.
But does that control over the language on Norma?
Norma is more restrictive because it's a smaller area.
Right. So if we're talking about areas within Norma,
Right.
avoidance is the gold standard. And I would like to see language
Mhm.
that specifies whether it's a quarter acre lot or any size lot that we have code language that is consistent with the comp plan.
However, not everything's in Norma. That's what they're trying to tell
I
you.
understand, but I'm just saying we should in the code specify that when it's in Norma, it follows that restriction.
So you don't have to look in two places.
Got it.
So,
Yeah.
excuse me for jumping in for a second. I had asked Jack for clarification about avoidance and mitigation, minimization in general. So, and I happen to agree with you, Wendy, about Norma, but I think we need to talk about, to decide, I think the motion is talking about everything, and then we have areas, as it says in the comp plan, where we have greater restrictions, which are Norma. I think we're a little bit confused, or at least I am, because we started out talking about those small lots, many of which might be in Norma. So are we going to work from a funnel, which is what, you tell me if I'm wrong, Jack, where we're talking about everywhere in the county, and then whittle down and have a discussion of Norma? Or are we going to talk about Norma? And Ginger also clarified that there's wiggle room all over the place, which my sense is you would like to see that reduced somewhat. Okay. Jack, Bliss was before Jack, and Tyler, and then Jack.
It seems, we're,
I'm sorry, but I said.
Yeah, I am looking for a bigger position versus smaller, only to facilitate moving along. And part of this is they're looking for our guidance. And from my standpoint, I'm looking for theirs. And really, it's true. And so it's almost suggestions on your part that make a difference. It's part of it's my ignorance about the specifics, but maybe that's an advantage here, because I think we should be dealing in a pretty broad stroke position and look at it as best we can. You guys tell us, hey, this would solve a lot of problems. These are clarifications that would make sense beyond just the a part of the county, but all of the county. And then we could look at that and evaluate it and say, okay, it's a good start. But to me, I think we could beat this to death getting specific with it, of which, I'm just not going to have the ability to participate. So I'm looking for the bigger picture.
I want to say something to that, but I want Bliss to have her opportunity to speak. She's been patiently waiting.
Well, I apologize for being late. So, I'm very concerned about our Norma areas, especially in southeast Volusia. And a lot of that Norma area down there is these individual lots, these defunct subdivisions. And here again, y'all are looking at little lots, when those little lots make up a large landmass. And when you apply these restrictions to these minuscule lots, you're missing the big picture. And this is where I brought up the economic impact last time. And I'm going to say that again. And as for this clarification of language that we're delving down into for these individual lots, I'm a real estate agent. I deal with this all the time. There are experts in this room that deal with that. That's why they're hired to advise landowners. Keith and Ginger have both said they fall back and go to the code that is there. Keith has already said it is well defined. I think we are missing the boat dealing with this minuscule one lot issue and trying to, you know, rewrite language that's already there and it's clarified, and there's plenty of people to help the people who don't understand it, you know? They hire Bill, they hire Tyler. So I don't think we need to mess with it at all.
Tyler?
So I think in more clarity in the definition, there's three categories, and Jack has suggested staying more broad stroked. And I'm going to disagree and suggest an amendment to the motion that we look at lots that have vested development rights today. So they're zoned correctly, their future land use is correct, and I can go apply for a permit today. Avoidance and minimization on those, we have a lot less teeth. They have a lot less teeth. In general, you actually have the right to go build a structure of some kind. So I think that that's one category of how are we going to apply the definition of avoidance and minimization. The second category is it zoned correctly? So when we look at the land scam areas, if we want to use that as the generic term here, those are all zoned mostly in residential zonings today. So they have an entitlement for dwelling units at a density that is greater than 1 per 10 acres, like a lot of ag land or resource or forestry type land would have. So in those areas, if you clump enough lots together, you could make a claim that I have entitlement to build 200 houses here. And then it's a question of, so how does avoidance and minimization get applied when you don't have vested building rights, but you have zoning entitlements? So there's vested rights, there's entitlements. And then the third category is, what about when you're just at the table and you don't have what you're asking for? You want to build 200 houses. The zoning today supports 20 houses. We need a comp plan amendment, that type of thing. That's where we really have a lot of teeth, I think, to shut things down. And when our clients come to us for advice, one of the things that we say is, if you can get something that you can build on, that's a heck of a lot easier. If it's already zoned, you're going to cut a lot of heartache out of your life. So this is part of our advice. I think it's 3 different paths that you walk as a developer. And so the avoidance and minimization steps are a little bit different. So where you are ignorant of the process, that's the one piece of advice that I would maybe have in what we ask of staff, is that they look at those areas of how are we treating those kind of 3 categories differently. And if I've termed this wrong, Jessica or other legal experts in the room, please, Mr. Chris, please feel free to correct me, because I'm just lawyer adjacent.
Lawyer adjacent. Oh, good grief. And then Wendy. That's good. Yeah.
Vested, entitled, and
Straight up.
So I'd say, how do you apply it to vested? So the Daytona Park Estates, the entitled, the I have residential land, I'm subdividing it, and the I have ag land and I want to do something completely different.
Okay. I'd like to ask both the lawyer class and the staff if that also makes sense to them. Sorry to put you on the spot.
Can you tell me if this doesn't make sense? But yeah, so if you have a vested lot and you're doing something that is sort of one that, and we can deal with that. If you're asking for something else, whether it be additional density or a rezoning, or you want to do a PUD, residential or industrial, if you're coming to the county to ask for something you don't have, the standards may be different. And I think that's sort of where you're getting at. The lumping together of small lots doesn't necessarily create a development potential, because there are other requirements than just did you collect enough to get a large enough parcel. But so I think from our perspective, it's more about what thing are you applying for from the county versus the way that that Tyler put it. But kind of like we have this language kind of in the tree ordinance where that rebuttable presumption, right? If you come in for a site development plan, if you come in for a subdivision, if you come in for a rezoning, standards apply. I think the staff could come up with good definitions or standards for avoidance and minimization based on the thing that you're wanting to do.
That would probably make more sense for tying it to code anyway, because you have all the procedures in code, so. yeah.
I will
That's why I
say
need
though
numbers.
that, one thing is that's still out there, I think, in my mind, and Keith, I don't know if you and Sam maybe, and Todd agree, but is this idea about, how much on a new development, right? You're coming in for PUD, you're coming in for subdivision, whatever. On a new development, how much avoidance is enough avoidance, right? And we are always looking for more avoidance. And that is sometimes the rub. What's enough?
And then Bill.
Death by 1,000 cuts too.
Microphone. That point I think is where I wanted to kind of steer us back to on the how much avoidance is enough, because I agree it's clear in normal. Outside of normal, it's what's reasonable. And we all know that that's the word that keeps me employed. Reasonable. Like lawyers wouldn't exist without it. So the threshold of what are you're entitled to something, but that doesn't mean you could build something. There are maximum entitlements. Where is the line? How does it work? And I think that basing it on application makes sense. Like the county already says that for RPUDs, you have to have 20% common open space. It could be that if you want to go through an RPUD process, you have to preserve a certain percentage of wetlands on site that you couldn't impact. I think it's interesting that even if you have developers who want to avoid wetlands to avoid costs, sometimes the lot size may trip you up if there's a certain lot size. And so, we've got the cluster subdivision regulations, looking at those to see if you utilize the cluster subdivisions, which allow you to transfer densities out of wetland areas, although the conservation subdivision does not, which drives me nuts. Maybe you can have smaller lot sizes in certain areas to balance out that density economic question with the preservation question. So those are just some thoughts on maybe direction on how we implement some.
Bill,
So I think it's a great idea to do it according to what your application is, and then you could take care of the small lots that are previously entitled based on a building permit, and those maybe you don't have any avoidance minimization. And then if you need a PUD or and this is where I don't know exactly how it works, but rezoning, then do have avoidance minimization and define that, but also have some of the economics in there. That might be important.
okay. So yes.
So Sam tells me. Yeah.
Jessica, do you still have a question?
Yeah, that was one of the points I was going to raise, that you can't condition it. But the second one is that you can't condition it on a site-specific application. You could create different standards in R3 versus R blank, different criteria like that. But I was going to say that in the comp plan, even as modified, but not so much in the zoning standards that we have now, which is again kind of one of those balance things, is that there are some land use classifications that have a minimum density that the county wants to see. And so while we don't have that in most zoning classifications now, that may help in the how much can you avoid. If there's a minimum density, you know that you at least get 1 unit per 5 acres. We're clarifying them in certain. We're getting rid of them in some situations, but we're keeping them in others. And the current comp plan changes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if the motion passes, I think the discussion here is enough that we can put some things on paper, enough that we could react to them as a committee. We get the general gist of it.
So to try to restate what we're going to vote on, does anybody feel extremely confident? I'll give it a stab. If not, I don't mind embarrassing myself.
We have a motion. We also have a motion to amend that wasn't
Yeah,
seconded.
that's what I'm.
So I'm curious as to where we go as far as
Yeah,
that.
where are we in this?
But it hasn't been seconded yet.
What? We're sticking with the main motion and not the amendment to be more specific per condition. Okay. That doesn't mean that staff can't come back that way.
Yes, there you go.
And I tell you that it may very well be that it's broken down into three parts. I mean, it's not, the main motion is a bigger picture, but I'm not bothered at all by it being chopped up.
Restate, please, Jack.
Don't mess with
Okay. So the direction that we're giving to staff, and that is the motion that we will now vote upon after much discussion, is to ask staff to come back with some specific language about avoidance and minimization for the general territory of Volusia County or unincorporated. Help me.
I think it's less specific than you just said. I think
Okay.
it's to have staff, based on the discussions that we've had here, come back with some language that would address avoidance and minimization in a way that we think makes sense based on what you've told us here today. Could be in Norma, also not in Norma, right? Could be 3 categories, maybe not, right? We'll come back with some language that you
Okay.
all can react to. And I just wanted to ask or clarify or whatever. If we go way back to sort of our original request or presentation to council about this topic, the discussion point was add avoidance and minimization language to chapter 50, because chapter 50 is much less descriptive in this regard, and better define it in chapter 72. So with the vote here, I'm thinking that that's what you're telling us to do, both things, chapter 50 and chapter 72.
Okay, is that clear for everyone? And we may now take a vote. All those in favor of the motion as stated and clarified by Ginger, say aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. 8 for, 1 against. Yes. Next. Paper is out.
So on our sort of list of things that we wanted to do, I don't know that what we just did was any of these, right? So suggestions on modified buffer widths and strengthening, comments on page 3 of the document that was provided last time. And that is where I think we did do that. That was the the avoidance and minimization in Norma. So I think we did talk about that. So we can talk about the wetland mitigation fees if you want. We do have maps available for any, questions you have about different areas of the county. And then we can talk again about modified buffer widths. If you
We
want.
do still want to see on the map the Norma, if that can be called up easily.
Yeah.
Okay, that's it. Okay, it's such a faint green. Thank you.
So that's without Norma.
Hmm.
And here are your city layers over here. And then here's Norma.
And the eco overlay, can you,
Yes,
can
I
you superimpose eco on Norma?
Yes, I can. And I
Thank
can-
you.
And I can remove the cities if you wish to.
No, there's
No, it doesn't survive.
Norma does not exist in a city. Eco, there is some eco in cities.
Yeah, because that's in chapter 50, right?
So everywhere that you see, that was over here, that's the city, and that's why, I mean, you have like, up here you have Tomoka and you have, it's part of Spruce Creek and some of that, so you'll see that follow some of those waterways. All right, let me go back up here. They put all these layers in 3 different places, so that makes it real convenient.
For me, it really matters to look at the various
All right, and there's
map
the
layers
eco.
because we're talking about something that's extremely abstract. And when you look at it on the map and you look at the land that we as a county have said is incredibly valuable for our survival long term, then it matters what we're talking about. And we've already established that, yes, we'd like to be referring to the cities with the minimum standards that they signed on to, but that's not necessarily something that we're policing. Okay, this is the eco overlay?
This is the wildlife. corridor.
Wildlife corridor. Oh, yes, of course. Yes, thank you. Okay.
So,
The wildlife corridor it has existed for more than 20 years as an incredibly important geographic area throughout the state of Florida for our biodiversity, for particularly wildlife, to be able to move throughout the state. In 2021, the state of Florida, the state legislature unanimously recognized it as a thing and put funding behind it, encouraging local governments to acquire and preserve the land within it. In Volusia County, we've been doing this with our Volusia Conservation Corridor since the year 2001. We've preserved about 55% of our corridor, which does extend into Flagler County. But 55% of what is in Volusia County has been preserved. There's more to do. And this is also, I'm not going to get too wonky, but biodiversity and protecting biodiversity matters for our food supply, among other things, for our long-term health in the world. And this also matters for our water supply. And I see the crossed eyes. It's a longer discussion, but it may be one worth having. So that's the portion of the corridor or the thing that the legislature designated. It used to be called the Florida Environmental Greenways Network. And those are the boundaries of it that fall within our county. There's nothing regulatory, and we cannot expand it. We can't expand the Volusia Conservation Corridor. We cannot expand the Florida Wildlife Corridor. That has to be done by an act of the Florida State Legislature or a change in the FEGN data.
you can't expand Norma.
Yes.
So you
can
can
do that.
expand Norma to meet those boundaries.
Yes, you could. The white when we have the cities on. So just those, can you do, yeah, those little cursor areas. You need darker colors on that thing.
Yeah, New Smyrna, Samsula, Pearson, Seville.
Yep.
Yeah, you have some enclave areas in Ormond and Daytona.
I'm an enclave. John,
The square in the middle of Lakewood, explain that one to me.
that's where we're having our picnic.
Oh, right here?
Yeah.
Huh. No, it's definitely not an island. I mean, we can. That it's just in the eco layer. Because when you turn on the Norma, it covers everything, but for some reason, the eco layer, skip, yeah. Well, that's water too. I don't know why that would just be a square in the middle of the lake. I can't explain that. Yeah.
Well, then it makes, I'm not trying to be sarcastic, but then it makes you wonder the validity of the rest of the map. If there's an error like that,
What's that C?
Conservation.
Okay.
just curious. I mean, you can draw lines and put in all the colors in the world, but when you got something like that that stands out, it makes you.
The static maps are on the county website, but
I mean, that is a good point. And, you know, we've talked about, well, where's the map of the wetlands, right? We have maps that depict wetlands, maybe, right? And I try to, anytime someone talks about the map of the wetlands, is like, there are maps, but unless it's ground truth, it's not the truth. So these are our best guesses. And as you can see, there are errors and every layer. That is a weird error for sure, but we do have, you know, when we get a development proposal, then we're able to verify that whatever we have on GIS is actually true.
Doesn't seem to cover water bodies anywhere else. So that's really strange that it's, you know, it doesn't cover the river there, it doesn't cover any of the mud lakes, and it certainly doesn't cover any portion of Lake George. So that's just odd.
Jessica.
It would be interesting to know if that lake was ever
Well,
dredged.
yeah, that's
Like a bar pit
eco.
is a perfect square.
And if we
And
cover,
then became a lake. But
if you turn,
no. And I was gonna say on the mapping concern, part of it is that when you do go out and ground truth, because there is an intent behind these regulations to preserve the natural resources. And so if you go out and the wetlands are 500 feet off, there is a process to say, we went out, we flagged it, we had it authorized by the state, and the line is wrong, can you adjust it? And there's a process for that.
John, do you still have your name up for a man of few words? Okay, so we voted and we were, pardon, Wendy? We voted and we were about to move on to fees, I guess, and looking at these maps.
which fees do you want?
So,
The last time, the question, several questions about the wetland mitigation fee. One, how much we're charging and how we calculate that. And Keith can go through an example of how we do that. We have the information about what we charge on a per square foot basis and how you get to that. And then I also have the information of basically what we've collected over the last several years. And I think there was a question about how we use those funds. So if it's okay, we'll start with sort of the micro level about how we calculate what needs to be paid and what that looks like. And then we'll talk, I guess, more big picture about how much is in the fund and how we use it. Is that okay?
There's all our stuff in our folder. It's on the G drive.
I was going to use your exit for break time, but okay. We could.
Do you want a break? It's a,
She starts at 2:30. So Wendy needs to go and so we could take a break now. Yes, we do.
We do. Bliss
We do.
appeared. Yes.
Yeah, we're
So-
fine.
For the record, Wendy's leaving, but Bliss came in.
okay.
Yes. So the universe is balanced. Let's do a 10-minute break and then we'll come back and talk about the fees.
8. You need one more than 50%. You have a 14. What'd you say? What'd you say? 18.
So we're just waiting for Bernie to come back. To wait for Bernie. Guess he's in the bathroom. We don't have the forums, right? Pardon? He didn't. He didn't. He left his stuff. I already checked that. Oh. I heard that there was an attempt, it's just a rumor, I haven't even been able to talk to the person who texted me, but that there was an attempt last night to reduce the millage on Volusia Forever. Santiago, of course. Pardon me? Well, there's a reflexive orthodoxy, as you know, that thinks it is, but
Just a brief reminder that we do have a bear forum race, so if someone has to leave the room to take a phone call.
Right. We have to stop.
Yes.
that's why that's why I haven't called back to order. Because Bernie, I can't go drag him out of the men's room. Thank you, Chris. Yeah, as I say, I have not independently verified this. But I wouldn't be surprised. They're scratching at the dregs barrels, and it's so interesting to me. Sorry to bring party into it, but the belief in free markets that so-called conservatives want and are driving the cost of home acquisition and taxes, because the taxes reset. I can't move, and I should. Yeah.
If you can tell us. Resident satisfaction, will not raise their tax base, and they are going to take this, and they're going to get taken up by the state. We will then say, you're going to take this, and your solution's on, and you're gonna get.
Because they've cut it to the bone. Yeah. And that's when people, this is when people start screaming, that Keith Chester, who speaks often at council meetings and with whom I usually disagree, according to press reporting, got up at the last meeting and said, you need to actually sit down and do the work about what are the services that are needed and what people want if you're going to look at trying to lower costs and cut taxes, not just they've stabbed at the cultural council, now it's communications tax. I mean, the gas tax, which we actually need. And they need to sit down and do hard work, what their constituents value. Personally, I like driving on roads. Okay, folks, our quorum is restored. It's all right. Good afternoon. So Ginger was about to share with us the fee structure for mitigation, or Keith. Keith was about to share. Sorry.
Okay, so what we have here is we have a typical plan and what we see. We just kind of want to walk you through the process a little bit. So this is a commercial storage. Why is it not letting me zoom in? There we go. Commercial storage area, and you can see here we have the wetland line. We have buffer. This is the 25-foot buffer, as you can see right here. And we have our impacts quantified in this section. And then
Trail,
here's
I
your,
mean, this looks beautiful.
yeah, here's your wetland line, here's your buffer line, here's your crosshatched buffer impact. Right? So are we good so far? Well, they are impacting the wetland up here. Yeah, right here. And then some buffer impacts here. So,
And those are for like a utility connection.
yep. Yep. It says it right here, impacts for utility and construction. And then the 248 square foot for the buffer or secondary impacts.
wetland top that's being impacted, and we have a piece of buffer in that little square that's being impacted. Okay,
Correct.
thank you.
All right. So, and then you can see the overall project here.
Mhm.
Zoom out a little bit more. It goes off site. It goes off this way and then goes off in this direction. The majority of this site was upland. Todd did the review on it, so if there's something wrong, it's his fault.
So for those of us who don't look at this stuff all the time, the big square is the entire area of the project, yes? The land that is owned for the project?
The cursor area, you can see that, right? This whole area is the property, the
Okay,
entire.
thank you.
property.
And then within that, the
This-
structures are what look like structures with
Right.
planting around them.
So this is a stormwater
Mhm.
retention pond right here, and this is your outfall, and that outfall has a portion of it that pops, if it were to pop off, it would come off into the wetland buffer. You have your landscape areas that go around here,
Mhm.
and then you have your buildings and parking in this area.
Thank you.
They needed to, Todd's gonna answer that.
So they wanted their sign to be visual from the road. And so I said no, but St. John's did not agree with me on that. So St. John's mitigated for that section of it.
So they let them trim a section so they could see the sign.
Where was that you asked about? Ah, thank you.
Sorry. What?
Go back to your picture. Drawing back there, the, one of, that was just to show where there was some impact.
Yeah, that's what we're showing. We're showing some impact, and then you wanted to see how we mitigate and what those fees would cost. So in this particular instance, the state picked up the wetland permitting, and we would take the secondary or buffer impacts, and we would come in and this is our Amanda permitting system, and we have a mitigation tab right here. We would actually edit and add this tab. We would fill out what type of impact it was, whether it was fill or construction in a natural buffer versus an unnatural buffer. See if I can open this up. So as you can see, we have sections here where we can add, and all these things add mitigation values for individual picks. So if it's in Norma, it's a higher mitigation value of or impact of the buffer than if you weren't in Norma. And in this particular area, we had 374 total square foot of buffer impact. And because it wasn't in Norma and it wasn't really a great wetland or buffer system, they only paid 45 cents per square foot.
So
Mm.
change in function. So what you had and what you end up with. And so the choices that you make here, was it fill? What was the vegetation before?
Mhm.
Those choices give you this ratio, and then that ratio gets multiplied by the fee. And like we talked about last time,
And the fee is the rate, that's right here.
the fee, this must have been last year because the rate is 1. We'll show you what the fee is now, but it's 1.0. 0.47 or something like that.
0.37.
So the big picture point is that you have an impacted area and it's impacted in X number of ways. And this is a nifty little software program that lets you input the impact. But if we didn't have that software, we'd say, well, we're we're hurting this, that, and the other. And the formula that we're going to apply is 3 cents for the this, 5 cents for the that, and we're going to multiply it by the square feet, and that's what you got to pay us. Yeah?
Basically, yeah.
Bill.
Right.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
And so when we talk about things that could be improved, right, we could talk about how those ratios get assigned. So right now, let me
Those
back up.
formulas are ratios. What Bill was talking about was,
Percent or ratio,
Okay.
right? Yeah. But let me back up just a second. So one thing Keith said at the beginning was the district picked up the mitigation for the wetland, right? Remember last time we talked about how if the state permits an impact and requires mitigation for that, we don't double dip,
Mhm.
right? So in this case, the Water Management District was the state permitting agency. They did permit and then require mitigation for the wetland impacts, but they didn't require mitigation for the buffer impacts. So then we do. So we're not charging mitigation for the same impact, but we're catching whatever they don't catch. In this case, it's just the buffer, and we apply this ratio. If it was the wetland impact that we were doing, we would use the uniform mitigation assessment method. That's
The
the
UMAM.
method that the state uses. It's not a ratio system. Although in our code, it talks about mitigation for wetlands as a ratio, right? Remember, because that's very old language.
yes, we
In
were going to
truth,
change
we-
that.
In truth, we use the UMAM. But so for this example, because we're doing buffer mitigation, we're using the ratios. One of the things that we would like to see changed is that if you had a perfect buffer and you had a complete impact to that buffer, so you put a house or a structure or concrete in the buffer, the way our ratios are set up right now is you can only ever get to 85%. You can't get to 1. And we think that that's probably not accurate.
If you're starting out with Bill's 1, you've got a pristine, perfect place. You can really only talk about mitigating for 85% of perfection.
Right, it just, so that's something that.
So that's
staff would
kind of,
recommend that-
yes, so we're in a hole from the get-go. We're in a hole in avoidance, in no net loss, in size or function. We're starting out underwater.
The formula, yeah.
Not anymore.
Sorry, thank you. The UMAM was originally written to take into account in its perfect condition, kind of pre-Columbian, before we came to you have all these humongous landscape connections, and we don't have that anymore. Now the district has, as they have continued to use it, they try to make the ratios higher or the scores higher. So generally you would have 0.7 on any kind of wetland that you might find almost anywhere, unless it's really degraded.
Yeah, I mean, he's correct. I mean, typically we see a lot of 0.6s, 0.7s, even a lot of 0.5s. So you rarely ever see what would be a perfect wetland system. It's really rare.
Yeah, I found, it's an aside and then we'll get to Jessica, but one of the things I found before Florida became a state in 1845, there were an estimated 20.3 million acres of wetlands, which is the equivalent of a little less than 4 New Jersey-sized states. Most of those wetlands persisted for the first 100 years of Florida's statehood. Even as late as the 40s, Florida was still the least populated state because we didn't have air conditioning, which is why in the Capitol, one of our 2 statues is the guy who invented air conditioning. Most of the wetland in Florida north of Miami were drained, dredged, or filled between 1960 and 1996. So that quickly, 36 years, we undid a lot of what just perspective of how we don't have any 100s and we have a bunch of 70s. Sorry, Jessica.
Question on when you're reviewing beneficial vegetation and all of that, is that when the applicant provides the environmental analysis and it has different soil and vegetation types, are they sorted from there, or is it just kind of a site specific, or how do you?
It's site specific and it's based on our inspection notes or inspection findings.
Yes, because I
Okay.
think it's good to understand how you're assigning this, but this is very weedy. And I think it's good for us to start with big picture.
Right, so just important to note, like she said, this was last year and it was at $1. Now it's at $1.37. So the entire monetary impact of the buffer impacts was $168.30.
For 374 square feet, I can't see.
Yes.
Is that only outside of the 25-foot average from the district, or is that the entire buffer to the wetland line?
That would be the entire buffer to the wetland line. Like, again, that's if the, what?
That's not even an hour of Jessica's time.
I was really getting at the NERMA 50-foot, and if this was beyond that, but I realized it's not. This is in a regular buffer and
It's
it's
in
the
20
whole buffer.
Yeah, it's in a 25-foot section and it's the whole buffer and they didn't pick up secondary impacts on it. So any impact to the buffer that they didn't pick up secondary impacts, we pick up that impact.
I wonder why they didn't, because normally if they impact the wetland all the way to the buffer all the way to the wetland line, they would cause you to not only provide mitigation, well, what they do is they make you provide secondary impact mitigation reaching into the wetland by about 50 to 100 feet. That's usually how it gets permitted.
I can answer that. When they did the original for the sign, they hadn't done those utility easements. They came in afterwards. So we did mitigate for the wetland. They impacted along that utility easement on the north side. We did do because the state didn't want to get involved with that little bit of area.
So the state didn't pick up the utility easement
No.
area?
No, we did
No,
that part.
No,
That's the you, ma'am. I sent you.
okay. So what? On.
You put it on.
Okay. Which one?
One with totals. Second to the bottom. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Fee history actual. Fee history actual, sorry,
It's been all day like this.
all day. Been 20 years like this. I don't know what you're talking about all day.
Yeah.
Okay. So, this is just to show that, going back many, many, many years, the mitigation fee per square foot has been $1. And our fees typically go up by the CPI every year. But until last year, the determination was rounded to the nearest whole dollar. So if your fee is $1 and the CPI is whatever it is, you go up a penny or 2 pennies every year CPI, but you never click over to $2, right? So it's been $1 a square foot since 2003 at least. And for a period of time, it actually did, well, anyway, it's been $1 a square foot for a long, long time. Now, last year.
What's the underlying assumption in that value? It seems not to have a darn thing to do with market value or value of water or value of recreation or.
Where the original dollar came from I cannot tell you.
And it was lower than that. It was 85.
Yeah, and a very, very long time ago, it was even lower. So we did get a determination last year, and so the fee change with this current year's fees was that it doesn't round to the nearest whole dollar anymore. So it does go up by the CPI out to 2 decimals. So it's $1.37 now, actually. The rest of this chart really doesn't matter. I just wanted to show that, in fact, we calculate the CPI, and if it ever got to $1.51, it would have gone up to 2. Now we're going up by the pennies. But the discussion we had last time, Jessica sort of roughly did the math about that is a very small number compared to what it actually costs to provide mitigation for wetland impacts. So,
Jessica, you have a comment.
Yeah, I just wanted to highlight again, I think that we did a rough calculation that the state criteria is like $15 a square foot. But my question is, have we looked at, because I think that you could argue from a rational nexus, proportionate argument, a legal argument, that the more wetlands you impact, the greater economic harm and need for mitigation. So have you ever looked at a phased kind of like a tax structure where you say for the first 20,000 square feet of impact, it's this fee, and then if it's larger than that, it's a graduated fee?
And I have a question within that. While I appreciate the logic and the rationality of that argument, my question would be to the functionality of that wetland, which we also touched upon last time. So, at some point, I can buy the wetland. And then we have had a net loss in size and function, presumably.
No, because you're mitigating at the mitigation bank. So if you bought mitigation at a mitigation bank on the East Coast, they're $120,000 per credit, divided by 43,560, which is how many square feet's in an acre. It's $2.75 per square foot. And then you would use the UMAM to bring that down, just to put it in perspective of this $1.37. And you don't actually mitigate for buffer impacts with the water management district. You mitigate the wetland impacts if you impact a buffer. They assess the secondary impacts into the wetland.
Mm. So once again, we have a legacy data point that we're unable to tie to anything in the rational world, and that's the dollar a square foot. And if we do agree, and it's stated in our comprehensive plan, that there are benefits that accrue to us, everybody in our county, from wetlands, it seems to me that there should be some sort of relationship of value to the destruction of a wetland or the harm to a wetland that has some kind of basis in some sort of rationality. I don't know what that is, but it should be there. Jessica.
So, and I only know this because I was in Port Orange last night. The Port Orange Mitigation Bank, the county just bought credits there for a project. And so we have Port Orange, we have Farmington, we have Tiger Bay. There should be enough costs out there to say that if the county were to mitigate for this impact, here's the rough cost. And then of course you have the ratio. But I think using the credit, because that's what you are doing, you're trading one impact for the other, seeing what that cost would be laid out, like what Bill just did, a rough estimate, might be something that's more supportable than the $1 that kind of came from nowhere.
Yeah, so I think what what the staff would be looking for is some recommendations from the committee about should we do some research to, well, for one, do we think that the dollar is something we should look at, right? Based, at least in part because we don't know where the dollar came from, right? Like what was the rational basis for that? And then do some research, what are banks charging? Now, I will say this, and this will be harder for us than it is for a private mitigation bank. That's very market driven, right? So when when the market is really tight, mitigation bank fees go up pretty well. And then they kind of, we're not going to do that, right? We're probably going to have something that is set and then it's a CPI based increase rather than total market driven. But at any rate, we could do the research on what it costs, what it really costs to do the mitigation. The other thing that idea that has come up staff wise is, and we'll talk a little bit about this. One of the things that we have done in the past with these mitigation fees that we collect is buy some of those small lots and antiquated subdivisions to prevent future development, to basically block someone being able to collect enough of those to put together a development in these wetlands that are also in Norma, right? So we could use a proxy for how much it costs to buy this type of conservation land, and we have some data we could use for that. Also as maybe a comparison to the dollar per square foot.
So you're talking about suggestions, John?
So talking a dollar, but I thought we just said we're at $1.37. Okay. All right. So we're at $1.37. So we have had some inflation occur in this past year. And then the other part was that you mentioned the mitigation money that you receive, or the money that you receive for these projects. What do you do with that money? I mean, because do you go and buy more mitigation property, or do you put it in the general revenue? Where does that money go?
So by ordinance, the money is in a trust fund, and there are some limited things that the money can be spent on, and it's intended to mitigate those wetland impacts that are being paid for, right? Historically, what we have done is purchase small lots in antiquated subdivisions. So basically preservation of other wetlands. I do have sort of where we are right now. So year to date, this current fiscal year, we've deposited almost $107,000 into the mitigation fund. In prior years, that varies depending on projects that come in. Last year it was about $86,000. So, there is some money available. Typically, we don't do projects every year. We could use the money to do a mitigation project, right? We could do a created wetland. We've relied on our other county partners for some of this. So like the small lot acquisition happens through our Bush Forever folks. The money can be made available for projects like if our stormwater department was doing something with a treatment wetland or those sorts of things. So we don't do a lot of projects with it because it requires, staff to manage and whatever, hire a consultant or whatever, manage a project. So balance, the reserves, the adopted reserves for this year. And so the adopted reserves are based on our estimate of what we are going to bring in, which we always estimate low. So the adopted reserves is about 177,000. That's actually, there's more in there than would be reflected in this number because we collected more than we expected to. So 200-ish.
So I'm glad John asked the question, but really this is two parts. One was potential instruction to staff to look at some rational funding. One idea floated was continuing with CPI. Another idea floated was what it would cost to preserve land with a wetland and maybe there are other ideas you'd come up with for us to react to. Then looking at how the money is spent, 107,000 was it?
177.
177, the placeholder for this year in the budget, is not a lot of money. It's not a lot of money at all to do any kind of major project. So again, to me, that's a disconnect from the potential of the impact. But as a tangential question, if you did get a good pot of money, I'm sorry, but I live so close to Ormond Beach. I pay attention to what they do in Ormond Beach. And they're working on, have been for several years now, a water storage facility for their reclaimed water so that they can increase the purple pipes that send out irrigation to people's lawns. And something I had been really interested in, tried to talk to them about, was a treatment wetland, which also becomes an amenity for tourist dollars, and public parks are all kinds of good stories about that. Is there any potential of ever taking that money and offering it also to grants and cities, given the size, given the portion of municipalities in the geographic area of Volusia County? So just something to, I actually don't really want to have that discussion now, but it's just a thought, because that's a carrot rather than a stick to the municipalities potentially. Jessica?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask on that point, because I have heard that as well. I believe if you're using wetlands for treatment, or if you use them for like storage capacity, you still have to impact them on the permitting
Unless
side.
they're man-made.
I say, I think
Yeah.
even, yeah, right.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So if you were creating wetlands from uplands, you wouldn't have to mitigate, I guess is
For that.
Melissa's point.
Thank you. Okay.
So the answer is yes, that is something we could do with it. Keith reminded me, I forgot, we did partner on a wetland creation project with Bethune-Cookman in the city of Daytona Beach, where we used some wetland mitigation fund money for their
With Dr.
project.
Cho?
Yeah, with Dr. Cho. But you're right, it's not a lot of money, and so you're not going to do a huge project with this amount of money, which is why we don't necessarily do a lot. We're letting it collect and collect, but at some point that money is intended to offset impacts that have already happened, and that's the intended use, and that's what the ordinance says. So the question I think for this group is the mitigation that is charged commensurate with the impact? Or should we look at those fees as we're looking at our wetland ordinance potential changes?
Tyler and Bliss and Bill.
So I wanted to clarify first, because the number on this is pretty low. This is just what's below the state mitigation permitting threshold, what you guys are having to collect fees on. So this is really the top of the tree for the fruit, so to speak, in some context. It's not like that's the reason the number is so low. I don't necessarily think it would be a bad thing to look at what is the average mitigation bank price per square foot credit area, because they're in acre credit areas, for the banks that are in the Volusia County area, and coming up with what was the average for the last 3 years or something, and using that to try to set where should we be. I think that we probably are low. Doing the math in my head, we're probably about half what we would reasonably be at to be in line, and I think it makes sense to just be in line across the board. The other comment that I want to make is a lot of this is the stick side of it, like Melissa was saying. And I know that we have a really good program with Volusia Forever. And I know that one of the challenges with purchasing property is that you can't buy what's not for sale. And a lot of times we have a development that comes forward that it has a particularly nice portion of land that would maybe be something that Volusia Forever would be interested in. But right now there's not like a trigger mechanism or an option mechanism for either side to have that conversation formally. Like there's not a, like, what is the county willing to pay for
Well, there is
wetland?
actually,
Is
there's
there?
a process.
If I have a development that has wetlands, I could be proposed for.
So under Volusia Forever, there are, of course, two hats. There's cycles. And so there are cutoffs on that. So I think what Tyler is saying is that when a site plan comes in, county staff isn't necessarily saying you may be eligible for a conservation easement for this if you submit to Volusia
But the
Forever.
cycles are 6 months.
Correct. They're wide
That's
open.
they're not huge cycles.
But then you have to wait. Right.
But we're
And
on
so-
2 to 4 week cycles
Okay.
with our submittal processes. So
Right.
a 6-month cycle is a huge delay to our clients.
So that's good to know. But the other point with Volusia Forever is the large landowners have received solicitation letters from the county. Would you be interested in selling? And if it's more than $500,000, I believe, the property, which would be anything big, it has to have 3 appraisals. It has to go through that. And then it is reviewed by staff. It's reviewed by the committee that Jessica sits on. It's put on an A list. If there's a potential for funding partners, it's put on a B list. If there isn't that potential, then it goes before the county council, who confirms that recommendation made by the advisory committee. So it's not, it is a much longer process than what you're talking about, but it does exist.
Well, and so maybe, correct my prior statement. Not that it doesn't exist, but it doesn't exist in a way that it's really being utilized by our average permittee in the process. And I see this as a situation where people have bought property, they've paid something for it. It's not that they don't see the value in conserving it, it's that they make more money if they don't. And, maybe some of the fight would just go away if we had a better way to connect those two dots. I don't have a solution. It was just a thought that I had last week. I was trying to think about, like, I have a project that we're killing because there's just way too many wetlands on it.
That's happening a lot with ag land right now because there are several programs that for conservation easements.
Yeah, with like St. John's has a lot of those little.
And the one that the county just signed last month with the Alachua Conservation Trust and the Rural and Family Lands Protection, all of those. So it is working very well with ag, not so much to my knowledge with regular development. And I'm sorry, I've spoken too much. Bliss and then Jessica.
Well, thank you for the discussion on Felucia Forever, because I was going to bring that up. My question is, because it's so little, who is your buyer for these credits, or who's your user? I mean, because you don't have a lot, and typically the ones that I'm involved with go to the private mitigation banks, and they're paying big bucks. So, who is your user? Is it a single user?
So who is depositing into the fund?
Mhm.
Okay. So we are requiring mitigation for any impact to a wetland or a wetland buffer that isn't exempt, right? So the wetland's less than a half acre, right? That if you're impacting a non-exempt wetland, you have to provide mitigation. If this is an impact that requires a state permit and the state requires mitigation, you're paying that to the state. That's where you're buying mitigation bank credits, et cetera. If it is an impact that either the state doesn't permit because it's exempt, like a dock or a seawall or something like that, then you're paying mitigation to the county. Or if it's a buffer impact that the state isn't capturing, you're paying mitigation to the county. So like in this case that we just showed, they had to mitigate through their state permit with the water management district. And then the impacts that the water management district didn't claim or didn't pick up, they had to mitigate through us.
Okay, so typically you if the state had, gotten it all, you wouldn't have had any piece of the pie.
That's right. That's right. And the reason that, the
Does
reason
mitigation occur in our county when the state charges it?
in the basin, yeah.
Oh, we talked about that. Thank
Yeah.
you. I'm sorry.
The reason that we've talked about why it's important to have a local environmental regulation or a wetland regulation rather than just deferring to the state is that there are so many impacts that the state doesn't regulate, like it's an exempt activity, or doesn't require mitigation for. So all of the docks and all of the seawalls that go in Volusia County, all, right? That's an exaggeration. Most docks and most seawalls don't require any kind of state permitting or mitigation. And so that's where our local ordinance is more protective, and we're getting the mitigation for that. And more importantly, we're implementing avoidance and minimization in those cases so that we're getting as little wetland impact as is reasonable in those cases. So is that your question? Who's paying in, right? Yeah, okay.
I mean, we'll go out and we'll do a dock for a dock inspection. We get a permit in that comes in for a building permit for a dock. We'll go out, we'll do the inspection, we'll do the UMAM, and we'll collect the mitigation, and all that time and effort we'll end up charging $35.
Jessica.
Two questions. The answer to number one, I am going to guess is no, but it could be yes in the future, is under the county wetland rules, can an applicant say, I know that I have these county wetland impacts and I'm going to buy a credit at this bank instead? They would never do that because it's only $1. But in the future, is that something that structure?
Yeah, you could do that, but no one's going to do that because we're way cheaper.
Right. But when we're not way cheaper, then they may. Right. Okay. Right. More expensive than what if you're just dealing with county wetland impacts, it's way cheaper to pay into our fund than to do any of the other things. Okay, but it's contemplated. So if the fees go up, there are alternatives. Yep. My second question, and this will tie into, I think at the very beginning of this process, we talked about how not everything that we may want to adopt is going to be within the chapter. And so I think to Tyler's point, where we talk about if you want them to conserve on site, it is kind of that cost benefit of one, what's the regulation, but two, are there cost savings? Do I get a benefit? What does that look like? The carrot rather than the stick. And I don't know that those are going to be created in the wetland section. That's more like the cluster subdivision or, some of the things we've talked about where if you have wetland preservation along the edge of your property, you don't have to plant landscape buffers instead. And those waivers and cost savings throughout the site development process that then give you the justification for avoiding those wetlands. So I think those spill over more into other areas of 72.
I will just say that mitigation at regionally significant mitigation banks is according to the hydrologic basin. And the three that we talked about are on the East Coast. The ones in DeLand, we recently got some mitigation for 60,000 per credit instead of 120. So that kind of, that's it now $1.37. So there is mitigation out there at banks. Just depends on which basin you're in. Yes. Then there's saltwater credits, which is $300,000, and it's not even available right now.
Okay, would anyone like to make a motion to ask staff to examine that, what seems arbitrary dollar amount, and come back with some potential methods of calculation? They came up with two right off the top of their heads.
You could look at the cost of land if the average cost to buy conservation land that has wetlands on it, or we could do the idea of looking at mitigation banks that are in our basin or in the basins of Volusia County and coming up with some sort of average and comparing that to the fee that we have right now.
For clarification, didn't you just say though that within the, West Volusia Bank, it's $1.37? It can be, you can have it at $1.37?
Yes.
Right?
Yes. And what she's saying is you would look at all of the rates across the whole county and maybe take an average or something like that.
Okay, so no one's going to make a motion. Then
I can move that just for further discussion on the clarity and my follow-up question. Never mind. I'll make that motion that to direct staff to provide an overview of the potential revisions to the credit amount based on what we've talked about. Or the fee amount, not credit.
I second it.
Any discussion? John beat you to it, Jessica. He was quick.
So talking about increasing costs in these mitigation numbers. What's the basis? I mean, what are we trying to solve here? Are we just trying to minimize the impacts and by doing that through a fee structure, or are we trying to generate revenue so that we can mitigate other lands? I mean, what's the basis for asking our citizens to pony up more money from a system that's already in place? And I guess it's a general question. I mean, no harm by it.
So the intent of the mitigation fund is to be able to offset the impacts that have occurred for that development. And to use that money then to have no net loss of wetland acreage or function. So the question really is that fee that gets charged sufficient to actually offset those losses? And,
So then I follow up with, is this practice done anywhere else in the state? Any other counties doing this in such a regard?
Mhm.
I would like to, along with that motion, then amend, that you bring forth not only your formula or your recommendation, but examples of where this happens in other counties and
The amount.
and how it's helped those counties.
And I think the motion was just as discussed on the board, so I don't know that we need to amend to do that. So, yeah. 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 We want to cover everyone. My only point was that it would be interesting, and maybe some of these other jurisdictions do that, where I don't think the county breaks it out by wetland type right now. So maybe that's something, if they have done that, to see what other people have treated like the state does. And I think that was it. I had something else, but I lost.
Okay, we had a motion and a second. Did you amend your motion? Tyler, I'm sorry.
So just as the other point that I think John was driving to is a lot of these are single family home permits, right? A lot of these conditions are happening on single family home permits. We're going to directly impact the cost of a single family home with this type of a change. So that is the balance that I think that we look at. Is we don't want to be punitive, because a lot of these are vested right lots that we want to have enough of a discouragement stick to prevent, but we don't want to just ultimately add cost that adds burden in my mind, existing vested lots. This isn't our big developments. This is our big subdivision.
So I have a question there for Tyler and for you, because the structure right now of the fees, if I'm looking at it purely as a cost of doing business and not caring about wetland at all, I'd rather pay into Volusia County's mitigation bank at $1.37 than the figures that you tossed out for the larger mitigation banks. But I guess that also gets down to the fact that Volusia County ends up charging the mitigation to sort of the dregs of the wetland, the impacted wetlands, because the district's going to take the big impacts and permit them. Because what I'm driving at is and don't have the little details, but what I'm driving at is our price structure should not incentivize the destruction. It should not incentivize going to Volusia County because it's cheaper for me.
No, I think this is actually stuff that's exempt. This is largely activities that don't require mitigation by other agencies. So
Right.
this is a further reach of regulation that already exists.
Beyond what they would district.
And what I'm suggesting is I see both sides of this. I'm not on one side, but nobody had really made the counterpoint. So playing devil's advocate, this is an additional expense that is applying only to those smaller projects, to docks, to houses, to accessory structures. You want to build a pool and you're impacting a wetland in your backyard. Those are the cases where a lot of this is coming in. And so these are our neighbors that are being more directly impacted by it. It's not Lennar Homes or D.R. Horton
Right.
or Coulter.
But when we talked about this last month, the memory kicked in. I use the example of what has happened in the area where I live is house after house after house has been built, house after house after house has armored the coastline, house after house after house. I mean, it's like the Daytona Park Estates in a way. I appreciate the point. I do appreciate the point, and I'd like personally to solve for something that's reasonable. But where you have one, you're going to have another and another.
Yeah, and I think what a reasonable outcome in the way that we came up with the pricing structure that is in existence today, because they didn't just make this up out of thin air. There was some methodology, even though we don't know what it is, or nobody in the room can report what it is. It may have been intentionally set below a market rate to not be overly punitive, and so that's a consideration that should maybe be given weight in how the price is actually applied, and it's something that, in looking at how other counties or other cities have enacted these types of rules, I think that that's one of the elements that I would like to see.
Yeah, I would say that to that point, and to John, your earlier point, I think if our keystone of the comprehensive plan is no net loss or function, then we have to make sure that our mitigation results in no net loss or function. And if it is well below what you need to actually pay for the offset of that impact, then we're not meeting that goal. And so I think that is the logic. And I get that these are individual homeowners, but I am not a fan of saying that big bad developers need to pay for something that individual homeowners do not. It's the same thing as the tree permitting. If you're impacting a historic tree, there's value there, whether you're a developer of 500 homes or if you own one home. The ecological value is still there, regardless of if you're developing a major subdivision or a pool in your backyard. And so my logic, and I think the law supports not discriminating based on development type and having a uniform method for assessment, although you can have some exceptions. So if there are specific circumstances or sizes that we want to exempt like we do now, that's one thing. But I think that's the basis for the request for the fee. And it may be that we do this averaging and we do this analysis of their codes and it doesn't change. If there is something out there for 137, maybe we say we were on the ball. That's pretty great. We can offset. Maybe not. Maybe we increase a little, but then we have that value that is backed up by something. And to Tyler, to your point, I think what we see that they may have reduced it down. Absolutely. Impact fees, affordable housing fees, all of those things you can see. They do studies that say our data shows we can support a fee up to $8 a square foot. And then the policy decision makers of the county or local government will say, that's a lot, let's do $4. And so it could be that that's something that we end up with as well.
I would like to add that a lot of the pools and seawalls, how much is a seawall now? $100,000? You're talking about a fee that's $35 now going to $70. How much is a dock? A dock's what, $60,000, $70,000? Again, you're talking about the fee going from $40 to $80. I mean, in the grand scheme of things. Yeah,
The only time that I see it
Right.
really being, it's if you're filling 3,000 square feet for a house lot or something. This is another $3,500 or whatever that we could be tacking on, or whatever it might be.
Mhm. Or avoidance minimization. And here we have, I don't know if you guys went over this example last time, but here's a great example of, a death by 1,000 cuts that we see on these lots that have, wetlands remaining on them or adjacent or have buffers. They come in for those permits, or in this case, they clear a wetland in buffer in violation. It's just something that's continuously happening, especially along John Anderson and a lot of the other water bodies.
Question. We're talking about having staff evaluate the cost of mitigation and if it's the fair cost. Have we already voted on the fact that they will get mitigation for projects that are exempt from E DEP?
That was a point that was brought up last time, in that there's the line between you're not going to require county mitigation where you have paid state mitigation, which is different from if you're exempt under a general exemption, maybe that we don't want that exemption to carry over is one of the discussion points, right? Like there's the site-specific exemptions, and then there were, remind me, there were people who came in and said, oh, we have a general exemption, so we don't have to go through this process.
So that's the
Right.
minimum standard thing. So in the minimum standard, the way that it's written is that, and I'm going to paraphrase, that if you have a permit from a state agency, you don't also need a local permit. What it's not very clear on is that if you have impacts to wetlands or buffers that the state isn't requiring permits for, that you should still have a local permit. That is our interpretation of it. The city's interpretation is, oh no, that doesn't require state permits, so I don't have to permit that at a local level. So there's that issue.
So whatever
other-
the state doesn't regulate, we regulate is what's the
That-
current state.
That's right. So the ordinance right now, chapter 72, the ordinance protects all wetlands except the ones that are exempt under half acre, et cetera. So whether or not we get to require mitigation isn't a question now. I mean, the committee could, I guess, recommend to the council, oh, we don't think we should do that. We think you should pull back your ordinance to the state requirements. That's, you could recommend that to the council. But right now, we regulate all of the wetlands and we require mitigation for all wetland impacts. So that's your question about, did we talk about, should we even be mitigating? Right now, we are. Yeah.
My point, which was really a matter of degree, it's awfully low at $1 and the actual amounts pretty small, and the impact even on an individual homeowner is not overwhelming in comparison to what the value is that you might get. So it'd be one thing if we decide, hey, we're recommending $10, then perhaps we want to talk about that. But when we're talking about the $1 and we may find that someone mentioned it may be $2, that's a different story.
So right now, just to put it in perspective, if you have a Daytona Estates lot and 4,000 square feet is exempt by DEP, that at your 137 is $5,480.
If you get to the $1.37,
Which
which
you
you
won't.
would probably get to maybe 85% of that if you
Okay.
had a pristine wetland. Right, so times 0.85, yeah.
And you're already requiring that mitigation. You're just wanting to increase the cost, the fee. Okay.
Yeah, on our one example, it was 45% of the $1. So, I mean, it would be pretty much close to half of what you said. So,
Okay, any more discussion on the motion? Would anyone like the motion that was made and seconded restated? Okay, all those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Yeah. Okay.
The last item, which is actually the first item in our next steps, was talking about buffer widths and strengthening requirements. I don't have anything new to offer from our last meeting. We can bring up the working document that we had last time and look at where we were talking about buffers, and remember we talked about the buffer research that's out there. We also talked about how the research is big buffers and the reality might be something different. So is that where we want to go on that?
I think that's likely a long conversation. we could kick it off, or we could carry that one over to next month's meeting unless there's a really bad reason for that. And I'd personally love to see, again, that within the context of all of Volusia County and Norma and whatever. You said your wetland maps are kind of so-so, and of course wetlands come and go, but so if we know whether we're talking about Norma or the whole county. And also I'd like to revisit the importance of a wetland at the beginning of the conversation. So do we want to start now? We've got 40 minutes left.
Only in NERMA, or are we talking about expanding buffers on all wetland alteration permits?
We are discussing buffers in the context of the whole county. One of the things that we talked about with the council before ENRAC was established or reestablished was, is there value in having graduated buffers based on the level of protection? So in the unincorporated parts of the county, Norma and Eco, to protect those wetlands that are in those most vulnerable parts more than maybe in other parts. That was one of the suggestions that went to the county council. We didn't really get too far into that last time that I recall, or we talked about the research that's out there about the value of buffers and what the distance needs to be to protect those values, you know, in a perfect world, right? And it's somewhere around 300 feet of buffer to protect the wetland and the habitat of the animals that rely on the wetland. And we kind of got to the point of, wow, 300 feet is bigger than most lots. Where do you come up with something that's, you know, reasonable going forward?
We have Jack, Jessica, John.
Thanks. Yeah, I would like, first of all, I don't think we could get through this topic before the end of the day, but I'd like it laid out cleanly as to what the buffers are between NERMA, Echo, you know, what the buffers are for each one, and then compare that to your suggestions, which you provided to us, so that we know the degree of the difference. Because you said what you think it should be or what you would suggest, but I want to know what it is now so I can see the difference.
Right out of my mouth.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Jessica.
Similar lines. I know that there are certain classifications in the county where we already have increased protections, like in some of the OCR, like the Osteen residential has like 100 feet instead of 25. Some of those examples of where we have the broader ones already would be interesting. And then any examples we may find in other jurisdictions, or if we have anything like that, on the concept that we touched base briefly on averaging kind of the flexibility of the rigid lines versus following the site topography or something like that.
Yeah, Tyler had brought up a measurement idea that was interesting.
Yeah, because you weren't here, Bill, the 300 feet came from a study in St. Johns County by UF, and I had the question, St. Johns County was pretty flat. What was the vertical change in those buffers that they averaged, and did that correlate to maybe less width being necessary when it's steeper or flatter? You know, what is the vertical component effect?
That was great.
That was at the very end. I was listening to that. Right now, it's just county buffer on wetlands under WAP is 25, NERMA's 50, and ECO is 50.
50.
Mhm.
In the Osteen, yeah, there is an average 100-foot buffer, but it's a minimum 50. So you just need to have that average square footage, but it's a minimum 50. That's the only weird, area.
And then there was some conversation about it can get bigger on OFWs or RHPZs.
Well, the code says these are minimum buffers. So if we can make the argument that, for whatever reason, if it's an RHPZ, it's in an OFW, it's in, there's some slope to it. If we can make that argument, then it just says that there shall be increased buffers. So we could, in theory, increase those buffers.
And you do that through the PUD process for
Yeah.
whenever you're
Yeah,
rezoning?
site plan, yeah.
Okay.
Do we want to continue today or shall we adjourn this early and let staff race back to go to work on all these questions for next month and come back and discuss what do you think, Ginger?
Oh, yeah, yeah, we did, I did ask for that, map of the residential lots with Norma on it, just because that came up at the beginning of the meeting. The other way is up.
The other way.
Keep going, there you go.
So those are the residential lots, undeveloped, with wetlands. And the light orange is the Norma overlay. So you can see the,
Okay, so if we talk Norma, we're handling the bulk of those. Thank you.
When you look at what's outside of the city boundaries, most of the county is normal.
Yes. I brought that up to Clay.
so if we want to talk about buffers next time, I just want to make sure I understand what you want. So we have in the document from last meeting, sort of what our
meetings
suggestions
ago.
were to throw out there. What you really want is sort of a chart or something that compares what do we do now versus what these options are. We could show those on a couple of typical, projects that have come in, some single family or some, a commercial or whatever project, and just to compare if that's helpful, what the buffer would have looked like if we implemented these recommendations. So if you want us to do that, I don't think we need I don't need a motion for that if that's what you
No,
want for next time.
No.
I was looking too, where it says about the outstanding Florida waters
Mhm.
and how that may play through this aquatic preserves, right? Because this would be different as a buffer.
Well, right. So, yeah, so right now they're not in Norma. But our recommendation would be that anything that's adjacent to OFW or aquatic preserve be included in Norma, then the
Then the
50-foot
buffers
buffer
go-
would
Good.
apply.
Well, then
right?
that should be part of what we look at. I understand.
But like Keith said, the code right now says a minimum of something. So like if you're a parcel that is a 25-foot buffer because of where you're located, but it's also adjacent to OFW, by practice, we're requesting a 50-foot buffer in those cases.
Right.
But it's not just clearly written in the code.
That would be interesting, sorry, to show what areas you're talking about and how it would impact if you did expand those in the OFWs and aquatic preserves.
If there are any, and I don't know, in the unincorporated areas, if there are any overlaps with where we have like the RHPZ zones and all of that, those are much larger. Those are like 300 and something feet,
Yeah.
right? So kind of that interplay on what that justification is and how those work in. What is that, riparian habitat protection?
Yes.
Okay.
I think for it to be a fruitful conversation, I think these maps are going to be really important because we're reading the words on the paper, some of us even highlighting them. And it is helpful to see what areas we are speaking about. And if we want to then tackle these as sections, I mean, we could. Yeah. I got nothing else, except for the standards for review. Are these things that we, are
Yeah, where
these
you at?
up for change, or these are just the things we're gonna look at? I'm a little,
So the standards, so this is the document from last time, that page 1.
NRAC wetland protection
Right,
discussion.
under the second, under the first task that we wanted to deal with in August was how do we define implementation of avoidance and minimization? We included that section, standards for review, because that's what exists in the code right now. And it's how we look at avoidance and minimization. So it was there for reference.
Okay.
And to kind of help clarify what we do now with avoidance and minimization.
Okay. That's what I thought, but then I was like, ah.
So if we're getting to the end, then maybe we could recap what we want to do next meeting.
I just wanted to ask you to add the comprehensive opportunity space overlay for the unincorporated areas.
To the map that you're talking about that we're going to look at. Yeah. The CISIO overlay.
That just went through a comp plan change a couple of years ago, I believe.
Okay, so for buffers, we're going to compare these recommendations with what is existing. We'll try to show on a map how this would look like if you added RHPZs and wildlife corridors, et cetera. So if we were adding areas to eco and NORMA, what would that look like? Include the space opportunity overlay on those maps. And look at what other jurisdictions are doing about buffers. Then let me find all my notes. For the first motion, about avoidance and minimization, we were going to bring back recommendations or at least points for discussion about how to improve that language. Maybe it's by type of application, maybe it's whatever the staff recommendation is, and we're going to look at both chapter 50 and chapter 72 on that. And the most recent motion, look at the fee amount, looking at what other counties are doing, maybe include wetland types in that potential fee, like saltwater might be different or whatever, or geographically in the county by basin, and any other recommendations or research about fees. Is that kind of where we left that? Okay. I got that on both. Yeah. But yes, examples of other counties. Yeah. Okay. I do. That's plenty. I do have an update on low impact development. It's scheduled currently to be heard by the council on October 5th. Yeah. Third, third. I keep getting 3 and 5 confused for some reason in October. We are having meetings individually with each council member in anticipation of this going to council, so we can sort of educate them about, for those that low impact development might be a new concept, provide some education ahead of time in the interest of saving time maybe at the actual council meeting. We've only had the first one of those. That was with the chair, Mr. Brower. So we'll be meeting with each council member and presenting your recommendations on low impact development. And then, of course, at the meeting, we'll present them in full and they will have their discussion there. October 3rd. That's a day meeting. Tuesday, yeah. So we'll ask, if Melissa's available for her to be there. If any of you want to be there and participate in public participation, I think that would, that's always helpful. But we do, we are presenting what are your recommendations, right? So the staff is presenting the committee's recommendations, but any of the committee members that want to be there, I mean, it's our goal to to present your recommendations truthfully, right? It's not my recommendation. It's what came out of the committee, but it's always good to have the committee members there too.
And those would be like, we voted for you guys to implement the tool to
Right.
then decide whether it should be mandatory or voluntary. That was one thing we voted on. That's what you're going to present, is that we voted on moving ahead with the tool. Is that right?
Right. So the actual motion was to direct staff to use the audit tool to find the places in the code to implement low impact development, a hybrid model where some of the elements are required, right? Those the avoid, right? The low impact development part of the planning would be required, and then have a menu of options for the minimize and mitigate. So the green stormwater infrastructure. So you guys voted on a hybrid approach. So that's what we're going to present to council, is that some things would be required, some things would be voluntary, right? There's a list of things you can choose from. Choose some of these and choose some of these, and come up with the incentives that would go along with those. But remember, since you made that recommendation, we then found out that we are subject to Senate Bill 250, which says we cannot propose or adopt any standards or procedures that are more restrictive or burdensome until October of 2024. So we're presenting 4 options to the council. One option is do nothing. We don't want to do low impact development. The code we have is good. We don't have to do anything. The second option is low impact development is important and we want it to be mandatory. If that's the direction of the council, it has to wait until October of 2024. The third option is we like low impact development, but it should be all voluntary. They could adopt that now. All of these also include use the audit tool to, figure out what parts of the code need to be changed. And then the fourth option is the hybrid, which is what this committee recommended. Again, that would have to wait until October of 2024. In the interim, we can be doing the audit tool.
Right. So essentially, what our presentation would consist of is exactly what you just said. We did the work to look at 4 different options. We think low impact development is important, but we decided that the best approach would be the hybrid approach for X, Y, and Z reasons. You are enjoined from making a decision on that right now, but that's what your appointed committee has recommended. And the time between now and when you can make that decision can be very well utilized by staff to use the tool to find all the pieces in the code that need to be adjusted to come into line with that. Yeah?
Correct.
Okay. Good.
And so what I'll do, we have a PowerPoint developed for the council presentation. It's pretty much a draft form. And after meeting with Chair Brower, we have some tweaks we want to make to it. But I'll make sure that you all have a copy of that PowerPoint in advance of the meeting. But it's basically a primer on low impact development, what it is, some of the definitions, et cetera, and kind of how we got to where we are, and then what the committee recommended. And here are your 4 choices, really. So
That was done in the June meeting.
You were the one that had the decisive sentence, by the way, John.
Yes. June 7th minutes, yes. Probably, it would have been Brianna or Rebecca, but they should be on the website as well. The ENRAC webpage should have the minutes. Yeah, that was, the motion was, ENRAC recommends that the county council direct staff to employ the LID audit tool to evaluate our land development code for existing ordinances that employ LID tools, barriers or conflicts to LID, and opportunities to enhance the use of LID and green stormwater infrastructure. This is with the goal of revising the land development code to facilitate a hybrid use of LID and GSI across the county to mitigate flooding and nutrient pollution. That was the motion by Member Anderson, Jessica seconded, everybody voted, Bill was opposed, everyone else was in favor. And who was all, were there absences that day? Barney was not here and Eli was not here.
So are we good on the, oh, Jack, sorry.
Yeah, my question is about parking. Because remember, I'd rather not go out and.
Clay's
my
not
car
here.
Towed away. So was that ever addressed?
No, I think we, when you come to this meeting, you need to park in the Athens lot. You will not get towed from the Athens lot. The one next to the Athens. Yeah.
But I want to park where it's nice and close right over here, where
And
they're
that's-
threatening me,
That's a 2-hour limit.
2-hour
And
limit.
that's the
So
city of DeLand.
it's city of DeLand, but I thought they were going to check on potentially getting something we could put in our car so that we'd be able to park there.
I have not followed up on it. I don't,
That was a Mr. Irvin job.
I know, yeah, well, that's.
Irvin is conveniently
I-
absent.
I will follow up with him and see.
No, I don't know. I'll have to go.
Yeah, but so is it 3-hour lot? Oh, okay.
So I don't know if that's true, but
I will.
I've seen him
Clay.
making tires.
Did you?
Make sure I didn't
Did
get
you?
tired.
Really?
And I didn't get tired.
Wow, okay.
I'm not expecting.
Who cares about that?
Okay, I'll follow up. I apologize about that.
No, we're talking about next door.
Or as I
Right,
say to
across
him,
the street.
"Don't touch my stuff."
Thank you.
You won't get a ticket in that lot if you can find a spot.
Okay,
Or like for PLDRC. Okay, okay. All right. I'll check.
has there been any movement on replacing whatever district Carrie was?
Yes, movement, but the initial movement was to take out of the original group of applicants. And so what I need to do, because that appointment would be Mr. Johansson, is I need to talk to Mr. Johansson and see if he wanted to recruit somebody rather than just use the existing pool. So that's on my list of things to do. We have our next meeting set? Yeah. Okay. See, that's what I'm getting.
Yeah, that's right.
No, it must be the 4th. Okay. Anything else?
Let me not trip you. A lot of money again. Yes. I never go anywhere anyway. Actually, I will be. I've got presentations coming in again. Not really.